For 20 years, I kept my mouth shut. 20 years of nightmares, 20 years of looking over my shoulder, 20 years of carrying secrets that could get me killed just for thinking them too loud. But I'm done. I'm done being afraid of ghosts, done protecting men who never gave a damn about any of us. My name is Tommy Razor McKenzie, and I was Mark Shultz's enforcer for 8 years inside Pelican Bay. What I'm about to tell you will shatter everything you think you know about who really runs the white crews in America's most dangerous prisons. I was 23 when I first heard the name Mark Shultz whispered in the yard at Pelican Bay State Prison. It was 2003, and I'd just been transferred from Corcoran after a stabbing incident that wasn't my fault. But try explaining that to the COs when you're covered in another man's blood and holding a shiv made from a toothbrush handle. "You're going to want to talk to Shultz," said an old-timer named Crow, his arms covered in faded Aryan Brotherhood tattoos that looked like they'd been done with a sewing needle and cigarette ash. "He runs things for the woods around here." The way Crow said it, with that reverent fear in his voice, made me think I was about to meet some kind of prison god. For weeks, I heard stories. Mark Shultz could get you anything. Drugs, protection, a cell transfer, even word to your family on the outside. Mark Shultz had connections that reached into every major prison system in California, Nevada, and Arizona. Mark Shultz had ordered more hits than the Mexican Mafia and the BGF combined. But when I finally met him, I was confused. Don't get me wrong, Shultz looked the part. 6'2", lean muscle wrapped around a frame that had been hardened by 15 years behind bars. His pale blue eyes were the kind that seemed to look right through you, cataloging your weaknesses, measuring your worth. The lightning bolt tattoos on his neck weren't just for show. Word was he'd earned every one of them with blood. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't put my finger at first. It was during my 3rd week in the SHU, the security housing unit, where they kept the worst of the worst, that I got called to see Shultz. The guards marched me down the corridor, past cells where men who'd never see daylight again pressed their faces against the food slots just to glimpse another human being. Shultz's cell was different, cleaner. He had a small television, books stacked neatly on a shelf, even a hot plate that definitely wasn't standard issue. The guards treated him with a deference that made my skin crawl. "Tommy McKenzie," he said without looking up from a legal document he was reading. His voice was calm, educated, not what I expected from a shot caller who'd supposedly climbed to the top by cracking skulls. "Son of Patricia McKenzie from Riverside. Arrested for armed robbery, 2nd offense. Previous stint at Corcoran for assault with a deadly weapon." I stood there, trying not to show how much it unnerved me that he knew my mother's name. "I hear you handled yourself well with that Mexican who tried to take your commissary money," he continued, finally looking up. Those pale eyes locked onto mine. 3 stitches in his kidney, clean cut, no permanent damage, professional work. "I did what I had to do," I said. He smiled then, and it was worse than his stare. "That's what I like to hear. Pragmatism. You know, Tommy, there are 2 kinds of men in here, those who understand that survival requires certain compromises, and those who die clinging to principles that don't mean shit when the lights go out." That's when he made me his offer. Protection, commissary money, respect from the other woods, and eventually, if I proved myself, a path to real influence within the Peckerwood organization. All I had to do was follow orders, no questions asked. "What kind of orders?" I asked. His smile widened. "The kind that keep our people safe and our enemies afraid." I should have walked away. Should have known that nothing good ever came from deals made in prison cells with men who smiled like that. But I was young, I was scared, and I needed protection in a place where your life could end over a pack of cigarettes or a sideways glance, so I said yes. The first job came 3 days later. A black inmate named Jamal Washington had apparently disrespected one of our guys during a card game. Nothing major, just some trash talk that got a little too personal. But in prison, respect is currency, and letting even small slights go unpunished is like painting a target on your back. "I want you to send a message," Shultz told me during yard time, speaking quietly as we walked the perimeter. Nothing permanent, just something that'll remind him and his people where the lines are drawn. I found Washington in the library 2 days later. Caught him alone between the stacks of legal books that most inmates couldn't read anyway. I didn't use a weapon, didn't need to. 3 quick punches, solar plexus, kidney, jaw. He went down hard, gasping for air, blood running from his split lip. "Next time, keep your mouth shut when grown men are talking," I whispered, before walking away. Word got back to Shultz within hours. The yard telegraph was faster than any phone system, and by evening, chow, everyone knew that the new fish had delivered Washington a beating on Shultz's orders. My stock rose overnight. But here's what bothered me, even then. Shultz hadn't been angry when he gave me the order. He'd been clinical, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. Over the next few months, I rose through the ranks faster than I'd expected. More jobs, bigger targets, greater trust. I learned the hierarchy of the Peckerwood organization, or at least I thought I did. Below Shultz were his lieutenants. Bull Morrison, a massive enforcer with scarred knuckles and dead eyes. Snake Rodriguez, a half-Mexican who'd somehow earned acceptance among the whites through sheer brutality, and Danny Ice Kowalski, who handled finances and communications with the outside. Each of them commanded their own crews, and each crew had specific territories and responsibilities within the prison. Bull's guys controlled the weight pile and the basketball courts. Snake's crew ran drug distribution in C Block. Ice's people handled gambling and loan sharking. It seemed like a well-oiled machine with Shultz as the undisputed boss. But the more time I spent around them, the more I noticed the cracks in the facade. It started with the phone calls. Shultz got a lot of them, more than should have been possible for someone in the SHU. Prison phones are monitored, limited, and expensive. But somehow, Shultz had access to a cell phone that appeared and disappeared like magic. I only saw it twice, both times late at night when he thought everyone was asleep. The conversations were always short, and he spoke in a code that made no sense to me. "The shipment from Phoenix needs to be redirected. Tell Milwaukee that the numbers don't add up. The Denver situation requires immediate attention." These weren't the kinds of calls you'd expect from someone running a prison gang. They sounded more like business meetings. Then there were the visitors. Every Wednesday, like clockwork, Shultz would get called to the visiting room. He never talked about who he was seeing, but the guards' behavior afterward was always different. More deferential, more careful, like they'd been given new instructions. I started paying closer attention during these weekly visits, volunteering for cleaning duty near the visiting room, finding excuses to be in the area. What I saw confused me even more. Shultz's visitors weren't what I expected. No leather-clad bikers or tattooed gang members. Instead, I saw men in expensive suits carrying briefcases, speaking in low voices with the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud to be heard. They looked like lawyers or businessmen, the kind of people who lived in a completely different world from the one we inhabited behind these walls. One visitor in particular caught my attention, an older man, maybe 60, with silver hair and a face that belonged on a corporate board rather than in a prison visiting room. He came once a month, always carrying the same worn leather folder, always leaving after exactly 30 minutes. I asked Bull about it once, trying to sound casual. "Who's the old guy in the expensive suit? Shultz's lawyer?" Bull's reaction was immediate and violent. His massive hand shot out and grabbed my shirt, slamming me against the cell wall hard enough to rattle my teeth. "You don't ask questions about Mr. Shultz's business," he growled, his face inches from mine. "You don't watch his meetings, you don't listen to his calls, and you sure as hell don't speculate about who comes to see him. You understand me?" I nodded, tasting blood from where I'd bitten my tongue. "Good." Bull released me and smoothed out my shirt with mock gentleness. "Because the last guy who got too curious about Mr. Shultz's private affairs ended up in the infirmary with a ruptured spleen. Took him 3 months to heal, and he still walks with a limp. But Bull's threat only made me more curious. In prison, Violent reactions usually mean you're getting close to something important. And the more I watched, the more I realized that Mark Shultz, the legendary shadow boss of the Aryan prison crews, was himself following orders from someone else. Someone who never set foot inside Pelican Bay, but whose influence reached into every cell block, every guard station, every decision that mattered. Someone who used Shultz the same way Shultz used the rest of us, as a tool to accomplish goals we couldn't even see. The myth of Mark Shultz was just that, a myth. A carefully constructed facade designed to hide the real power structure that controlled not just our prison, but networks that stretched across the entire American correctional system. I was about to learn that the man I thought was the king was actually just another pawn in a game so vast and complex that it made our little prison politics look like children playing with toy soldiers. And when you're just a pawn, your life can be sacrificed at any moment to protect the real players. The first crack in my understanding came 6 months into my time as Shultz's enforcer. A new fish named Riley Patterson got transferred in from Chino. Young kid, maybe 21, with swastika tattoos fresh enough that they were still healing and eyes that hadn't yet learned prison paranoia. Riley made the mistake of running his mouth in the chow hall, bragging about connections his older brother supposedly had with the Aryan Brotherhood on the outside. Said his family had been in the movement since before the AB even existed, that his grandfather had run with guys who'd inspired the whole prison white power structure. Normally, this kind of talk would earn you a beating for claiming rep you hadn't earned. But Shultz's reaction was different. Instead of ordering Riley taught a lesson, he seemed interested, almost excited. "Bring him to me tonight," Shultz told me after evening count. Alone, I found Riley in his cell, writing a letter to what I assumed was his girlfriend on the outside. The letter was full of the usual bullshit. How he was staying strong, how he'd be out soon, how he was learning from his mistakes. The kind of lies we all told the people we'd left behind. "Shultz wants to see you," I said. Riley looked up, and I saw fear flicker across his face. Good. Maybe he wasn't as stupid as I'd thought. What about? You'll find out. I escorted him through the corridors, past the cells where lifers played chess with pieces carved from soap, and young gang members practiced knife techniques with rulers wrapped in towels. The usual night sounds of prison life, muffled conversations, the squeak of mattresses, the occasional cry of someone having a nightmare about the outside world. Shultz was waiting in the common area, standing by the windows that looked out onto the yard. The moonlight cast his shadow long across the concrete floor, making him look larger than life. It was a calculated pose. I'd seen him practice it. "Riley Patterson," Shultz said without turning around. "Your grandfather was Thomas Patterson, wasn't he? Tommy the Tank Patterson?" Riley's eyes widened. I could see him trying to figure out how Shultz could possibly know that. "Yeah," Riley said carefully. "He was." Now Shultz turned, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not the usual calculated authority, but something closer to nervousness? Anticipation? "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," Shultz continued. "Helped establish some of the foundational principles that still guide our organization today. I had the privilege of meeting him once, many years ago. This was impossible." Shultz was maybe 45 years old. Riley's grandfather would have been active in the 1960s and 70s, when Shultz was just a kid, if he'd even been born yet. But Riley was young and impressed and desperate for connection to something bigger than himself. He ate it up. "He used to tell stories," Riley said, his chest puffing out with pride, "about the early days, before things got so complicated." "Complicated," Shultz repeated, and now his smile was sharp. "Yes. That's a good word for it. Tell me, Riley, what did your grandfather say about the people who came before? The ones who set the real foundation?" I watched this conversation with growing unease. There was something wrong with it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Shultz was fishing for information, but not in the way a prison boss usually did. This felt more like an interrogation, like Riley was being tested against some criteria I couldn't understand. He talked about meetings, Riley said slowly. Secret meetings with men who had real power. Not just prison power, but power on the outside. Men who could make things happen in the real world. Shultz nodded, as if Riley had passed some kind of test. These men your grandfather met with, Shultz said. Did he ever mention their names? Riley shook his head. He said names were dangerous, that the real leaders stayed invisible, let other people take the credit and the heat. Said that's how they'd survived, so. Long while everyone else got locked up or killed. Smart man, your grandfather. Shultz walked over to Riley, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder with almost fatherly affection. The bloodlines remember, don't they? Even when the conscious mind forgets, the bloodlines remember. I had no idea what he was talking about, but Riley seemed to understand perfectly. His eyes lit up with the kind of fervor I'd seen in religious converts and new gang members, the desperate hunger to belong to. Something greater than yourself. I remember, Riley said. Good, Shultz said. Then you'll understand when I tell you that your real work begins now. Everything you've done up until this point, the arrests, the convictions, even ending up here, has been preparation. The bloodlines always find their way home, Riley. Always. That night, after Riley had been escorted back to his cell, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning over what I'd witnessed, trying to make sense of it. Shultz had talked about bloodlines like they were mystical things, about invisible leaders and secret meetings that supposedly stretched back decades. It sounded like conspiracy theory bullshit, but Shultz wasn't the type to indulge in fantasy. Everything he did was calculated, purposeful. So what was he really after? The answer came 2 weeks later, in the form of another phone call. I was doing my usual late-night cleaning rounds, a job that gave me legitimate reasons to be in areas where I might overhear interesting conversations, when I heard Shultz's voice coming from the supply closet near the guard station. The Patterson boy confirmed it. He was saying in low, urgent tones, "The bloodline is authentic. His grandfather was definitely part of the original structure." There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke. "Yes, sir. I understand the importance. If there are others like him, descendants of the founding families, we need to identify them and bring them into the fold. The generational knowledge they carry could be invaluable." Another pause. "No, sir. The boy doesn't realize what he's inherited, but that can be cultivated. His grandfather apparently shared enough stories to establish the foundation. With proper guidance, he could become a significant asset." I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. "The timeline is still feasible," Shultz continued. "Our positions in the major facilities are secure, and the networks are expanding as planned. But we're going to need more true believers, people whose loyalty goes deeper than financial incentives or fear. The bloodlines provide that." What I was hearing challenged everything I thought I knew about the Peckerwood organization. This wasn't just a prison gang focused on territory and respect. This was something much larger, much more organized, with goals that extended far beyond the walls of any single facility. And Shultz wasn't the mastermind I'd believed him to be. He was taking orders from someone else, someone he called Sir, with genuine deference. "Yes, sir. I'll prepare the introduction. The council meeting is still scheduled for next month?" Council meeting. There was a council, apparently, and Shultz answered to them. "Understood. And, sir, the McKenzie situation, should I proceed with the next phase?" My blood froze. McKenzie. He was talking about me. "Yes, sir. He's proven reliable, and his background makes him suitable for deeper involvement. Plus, his mother's situation provides the necessary leverage if his loyalty ever becomes questionable." My mother. They knew about my mother, had apparently researched her situation, whatever that meant, and were prepared to use her against me if necessary. "I'll begin the process immediately. By the time of the council meeting, he should be ready for full indoctrination." The call ended, and I heard Shultz moving around inside the supply closet. I managed to get back to my cleaning duties just as he emerged, but not before. I caught a glimpse of what he was carrying. A thick folder filled with papers, and on top of it, a photograph that made my stomach drop. It was a picture of my mother, taken recently enough that I could see the gray in her hair that hadn't been there when I'd last seen her. She was walking out of what looked like a grocery store, completely unaware that she was being watched. Shultz saw me looking and smiled that cold smile I'd come to dread. "Working late again, Tommy?" he said casually. "Just finishing up the floors, Mr. Shultz." "Good. Dedication is important. Loyalty is even more important." He tucked the folder under his arm. "Tell me, Tommy, how much do you really know about your family history?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Your bloodline, your heritage, the choices your ancestors made that led to you being here, in this place, at this time." He stepped closer, and I could smell the coffee on his breath, could see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow that he'd gotten in a knife fight his second year inside. "Do you believe in destiny, Tommy?" "I believe in making your own choices," I said. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong. Some choices were made for us long before we were born. Some paths were laid out by men who understood that true change requires generational thinking, planning that spans decades rather than years." He was talking in riddles again, the way he had with Riley Patterson. But unlike Riley, I wasn't buying into the mystical. "Bullshit." "I don't understand," I said. "You will," Shultz replied. "Soon, you'll understand everything. The real history, the true purpose, the reason men like us exist in places like this." He patted my shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, but felt more like a threat. "Your education is about to begin, Tommy. I hope you're ready for it." As he walked away, I realized that whatever I'd stumbled into was much bigger and much more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. The Aryan. Prison crews weren't just gangs. They were part of some larger network, some generational conspiracy that stretched back decades and forward into a future I couldn't begin to comprehend. And somehow, my family, my bloodline, was connected to it in ways that made me valuable enough to surveil, manipulate, and ultimately use for purposes I hadn't yet been told about. The myth of Mark Shultz was crumbling before my eyes, revealing something far more terrifying underneath. A carefully orchestrated system that treated human beings like chess pieces in a game where the stakes were so high that individual lives meant nothing. I was no longer just a prison enforcer following orders for protection and commissary money. I was being groomed for something else, something that would require a loyalty deeper than fear and more permanent than any prison sentence. The invisible hierarchy was about to become visible, and I had a sick feeling that once I saw it clearly, there would be no going back to the simple world of prison politics and yard respect. My real education was about to begin, and I suspected it would end with either my complete indoctrination or my death. 3 weeks after that late-night phone call, everything changed. I was called to the warden's office on a Tuesday morning, something that should have been terrifying but felt more like a formality. The guards who escorted me were different from the usual crew. Cleaner uniforms, better posture, the kind of professionalism you usually only saw when state inspectors were visiting. Warden Carlisle was waiting for me, but he wasn't alone. Sitting across from his desk was the silver-haired man I'd seen visiting Shultz, the one with the expensive suits and corporate demeanor. Up close, he looked even more out of place in a maximum security prison, like a bank president who'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. "Mr. McKenzie," Warden Carlisle said, his voice carrying a deference that made my skin crawl. "I'd like you to meet Mr. Harrison. He's here on behalf of a rehabilitation program that might be of interest to you." Harrison stood and extended his hand. His grip was firm, confident, the handshake of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Tommy," he said, and his use of my first name felt both intimate and threatening. "I've heard impressive things about you. Please, sit." I remained standing. In prison, you never sit when you can stand, never relax when you're in unfamiliar territory. Harrison smiled as if my caution amused him. "Of course. Institutional habits die hard, don't they? But I assure you, Mr. McKenzie, this conversation is entirely voluntary. You're free to leave at any time. Warden Carlisle cleared his throat. Mr. McKenzie, Mr. Harrison represents a private foundation that works with select inmates to provide educational and career opportunities. The program has an excellent success rate in terms of post-release outcomes. What kind of program? I asked. Harrison opened his leather folder and withdrew a document that looked more like a corporate contract than anything related to prison rehabilitation. We call it the Heritage Foundation Initiative, he said. It's designed for individuals with specific genealogical qualifications who demonstrate leadership potential and unwavering loyalty to their community. There was that word again, heritage. The same concept Shultz had been obsessing over with Riley Patterson, the same bloodline mysticism that had made my skin crawl. I'm not interested, I said. I think you should hear the full proposal before making that decision, Harrison replied calmly. The program offers immediate benefits as well as long-term opportunities. For instance, your mother's medical bills, the treatment for her diabetes, the insulin costs that have been draining her savings, those could be taken care of immediately. My blood went cold. They knew about my mother's medical condition, knew about her financial struggles, had apparently been watching her closely enough to understand exactly what kind of pressure would motivate me. How do you know about my mother? I asked. We know about everyone we're interested in, Mr. McKenzie. It's not personal surveillance. It's due diligence. We invest significant resources in the people we recruit, so naturally we need to understand their circumstances, their motivations, their pressure points. He said it so casually, as if having my mother followed and investigated was just standard business practice. The Heritage Foundation has been active for over 50 years. Harrison continued. We identify individuals whose family histories intersect with certain pivotal moments in American correctional philosophy. Your great-grandfather, for instance, worked as a guard at Folsom Prison in the 1940s. Your grandfather did 3 years at San Quentin in the 1960s for assault charges that were later revealed to be politically motivated. Your father spent time in county lockup for tax resistance in the 1980s. I stared at him. None of this was information I'd ever shared with anyone, and most of it I'd barely known myself. My father had never talked about his arrest, and my mother had mentioned my great-grandfather's prison work only once in passing. The patterns are remarkable when you look at them over time, Harrison said. Generational involvement with the correctional system, often on both sides of the bars. It suggests a deeper understanding of institutional dynamics, a genetic predisposition toward both authority and resistance. You're talking about eugenics, I said. Harrison's smile never wavered. I'm talking about recognizing talent wherever it exists and providing opportunities for that talent to flourish. The Heritage Foundation operates programs in 17 states. Mr. McKenzie. We have partnerships with private prisons, law enforcement agencies, and correctional officers' unions. Our graduates hold positions of influence throughout the American justice system. He pulled out another document, this one filled with photographs and organizational charts that made my head spin. I saw pictures of men in suits shaking hands with politicians, correctional officers receiving awards, and what looked like corporate board meetings in rooms that definitely weren't inside prisons. This is the real structure, Harrison said. Not the gangs, not the yard politics, not the territorial disputes over commissary profits. This is the network that actually determines policy, shapes legislation, influences judicial decisions, and controls the flow of resources through the correctional system. I looked closer at the photographs and felt my stomach drop. I recognized some of the faces, not because I knew them personally, but because I'd seen them in newspapers and on television. Politicians, judges, law enforcement officials, corporate executives. Mark Shultz is just one of our field operatives, Harrison continued. Talented, certainly, and effective within his assigned parameters. But he's middle management, Mr. McKenzie. The real decisions are made by people you've never heard of, in meetings that don't officially exist, pursuing goals that span decades rather than election cycles. What goals? I asked. Harrison closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. American corrections is a $200 billion industry, Mr. McKenzie. 2 million people currently incarcerated with turnover rates that ensure constant demand for services, private prisons, bail bond companies, electronic monitoring firms, commissary contractors, medical providers, transportation services, communication systems. The ecosystem is vast and profitable. He gestured toward the walls of the warden's office, as if encompassing the entire prison system. But it's also chaotic, inefficient, and vulnerable to political interference. Reform movements, civil rights activism, budget constraints, public opinion. These forces create instability that threatens long-term profitability. What the Heritage Foundation provides is stability through strategic influence. You're talking about controlling the prison system for profit. I'm talking about bringing professional management practices to an industry that has operated on ad hoc policies for too long. The men we recruit, people like yourself, like Mr. Shultz, serve as our eyes and ears within the facilities. They identify problems before they become crises. They influence inmate behavior to maintain order, and they ensure that the right people are in position when opportunities for advancement arise. Harrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the yard where inmates were beginning their afternoon recreation time. Your role would begin immediately, he said. Enhanced commissary privileges, better cell assignment, protection from any threats that might arise from your current activities. In 18 months, when you're eligible for parole, we'll ensure that process goes smoothly. Upon release, you'll have a job waiting, good salary, full benefits, opportunities for advancement based on performance. And what do I have to do for all this? Continue doing what you're already doing. Follow Mr. Shultz's orders, maintain discipline among your associates, report on potential problems or opportunities. The only difference is that you'll understand the larger context of why these activities matter. He turned back to face me, and his expression was serious now. There will also be educational components. You'll learn about the history of correctional philosophy, the economic structures that sustain the system, the political relationships that determine policy. You'll understand how decisions made in corporate boardrooms translate into daily life for the 2 million people currently behind bars. And if I refuse? Harrison's smile returned, but it was colder now. Then you'll complete your current sentence. Under existing conditions. Your mother's medical expenses will remain her responsibility. Your parole hearing will be subject to the usual bureaucratic delays and uncertainties. And your safety within this facility will depend entirely on your personal relationships and reputation. It wasn't quite a threat, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. Accept their offer or face an uncertain future with no protection from the forces they claim to control. Warden Carlisle cleared his throat. Mr. McKenzie, this is an extraordinary opportunity. The Heritage Foundation has an excellent track record with its participants. I've seen careers transformed, families reunited, lives rebuilt from the ground up. I looked at both men, the warden who was supposed to be running this prison but was clearly taking orders from someone else, and the corporate executive who spoke about human beings like inventory in a warehouse management system. I need time to think about it, I said. Of course, Harrison replied. Take all the time you need, but I should mention that the foundation only extends offers like this once. If you decline, there won't be another opportunity. As I was escorted back to my cell, my mind was racing. Everything I'd believed about the power structure in prison, hell, everything I'd believed about the entire correctional system, was apparently wrong. Mark Shultz wasn't the shadow boss pulling strings from behind the scenes. He was just another employee in a corporate hierarchy that extended far beyond prison walls. The Heritage Foundation, or whatever it really was, had been operating for over 50 years. They had people placed throughout the system. Guards, administrators, probably parole officers, and judges. They used genealogical research to identify potential recruits, then leveraged personal circumstances to ensure compliance. And they'd been watching my family for generations, treating us like breeding stock for their institutional purposes. That night, Shultz came to see me. He found me in my cell after lights out, appearing like a ghost in the darkness. How did the meeting go? He asked. You knew about it? Of course I knew about it. I recommended you for the program, Tommy. I've been grooming you for it since the day you arrived. The casual admission hit me like a physical blow. All of this, the jobs, the promotions, the trust, the gradual increase in responsibility, had been orchestrated from the beginning. Why me? I asked. Because you're perfect for what they need. Smart enough to understand complex instructions, tough enough to handle the difficult assignments, and desperate enough to be loyal. Plus, your bloodline gives you credibility with certain populations they want to influence. What populations? Shultz sat down on my bunk uninvited, making himself comfortable like we were old friends having a casual conversation. There are networks, Tommy. Connections between families that go back generations. Some of those families have members in prison, some have members in law enforcement, some have members in politics or business. The Heritage Foundation maps these networks and uses them to coordinate activities across multiple sectors. Coordinate what activities? Whatever serves their interests. Sometimes it's maintaining order during budget negotiations. Sometimes it's influencing jury selection in high-profile cases. Sometimes it's ensuring that certain reforms never make it out of committee. He leaned closer, and I could see the fervor in his eyes, the true believer's conviction that made him more dangerous than simple greed or ambition. They're building something, Tommy. Something bigger than any single prison or gang or political movement. A system that can't be reformed or abolished because it's embedded in the very structure of American society. And they want us to be part of it. What if I say no? Shultz's expression hardened. Then you become a liability. And liabilities get eliminated. It wasn't a threat from him personally. It was a warning about forces beyond his control. The council meets next week, he continued. If you accept the Foundation's offer, you'll have the privilege of seeing how the real decisions get made. If not, he shrugged. Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that. After he left, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd learned. The Aryan prison crews, the gangs, the violence, the politics, all of it was just surface. Noise, designed to distract from the real power structure operating underneath. Somewhere out there, in corporate boardrooms and private clubs, people I'd never heard of were making decisions that affected the lives of millions of incarcerated Americans. They used people like Shultz as middle management and people like me as foot soldiers. But the real war was being fought at levels we couldn't even see. And they wanted me to join them, to become part of a conspiracy so vast and entrenched that it had infiltrated every aspect of the American justice system. The only question was whether refusing their offer would be an act of resistance or just a faster path to destruction.